There's a moment that happens in some workplaces that can feel almost surreal. It's when you realize you're being asked to train someone who's about to become your boss. And as you're walking them through the work, it slowly becomes clear that they don't really understand the job. Before we get into the story, the details have been generalized for privacy. There was someone I worked with who had been in their role for years. They knew the systems, they understood the clients, and they understood how the work actually got done. The kind of knowledge that builds slowly over time. Eventually, leadership announced that a new manager would be joining the team, and that this new person would be overseeing the department. And naturally, everyone assumed that whoever stepped into that role would already understand the work. I mean, after all, managing a team usually requires understanding what the team does. But when the new manager arrived, something became clear pretty quickly. They didn't really understand the job, not the systems, not the day-to-day work, not the small details that actually made the operation run. So the person who had been doing the job for years was asked to help get them up to speed, and at first that seemed reasonable. After all, when someone new joins a team, there's always some onboarding. But as the weeks went on, something became increasingly obvious, that the training never really ended. 9 months passed, and the situation hadn't changed. The new manager still depended heavily on the person who had originally trained them. Questions that should have been simple still required help, and decisions that should have been straightforward still required guidance. In many ways, the person doing the training still understood the job far better than the person who was managing it. People on the team began noticing something else, that this new manager, they had connections within the organization, relationships with people higher up in leadership, which explained something that had originally confused everyone, which was how they had been hired into the role in the first place. Once that dynamic became clear, another pattern started appearing. The new manager, sometimes they'd arrive late to the office, and often they'd explain that the commute from the neighboring city made mornings difficult, and that they would end up leaving early some days for appointments or other commitments, and they took more vacation time than most people believed was normally allowed. And no one was entirely sure whether those things were being approved or whether they were simply happening. Because when somebody's connected to the people above them, the normal rules sometimes become harder to interpret. As the months passed, morale in the department began changing. People noticed that the person who understood the work the most was still doing the same job, while the person who depended on them was now their manager. The message that situation sends can be subtle but powerful. If expertise isn't what leads to advancement, people begin wondering what actually does. Two years later, something else had happened. Most of the people who had been part of the team before that manager arrived were gone. They'd moved on to other companies, other opportunities, other environments, and the person who had originally trained the manager was one of the few still standing. Situations like this raise uncomfortable questions about how organizations make decisions. Sometimes promotions and hiring decisions aren't driven purely by expertise. Sometimes relationships and connections play a role, and when that happens, the people doing the work often notice. Not immediately, but eventually. From a leadership perspective, there can be reasons decisions like this happen, because organizations often prioritize trust. They prefer promoting people they already know, and people whose judgment they can feel comfortable relying on. But that approach can create unintended consequences, because the people closest to the work often see a different side of the situation. So it raises an interesting question. When someone is asked to train the person who will eventually manage them, what does that say about how the organization values expertise? And if the people who understand the work the most aren't the ones leading it, what kind of message does that send to everyone else watching?